Since its earliest days, cinema of all genres has become a vehicle for political and ideological messages, addressing the prevalent issues of its time. In horror and science fiction in particular, creative directors have found ways to address contemporary issues through otherworldly or supernatural surrogates, commenting on real ideas via fictional proxy. So while the horror film It Follows can be analyzed in terms of its commentary on sexuality and gender identity, we believe the film is also making a powerful political statement, addressed directly towards the millennial generation. The American dream that has been sold to first-world young adults has slowly turned into a nightmare. It Follows tells a simple but horrifically brilliant story about Jay, a suburban girl who, after a one-night stand, finds herself being targeted by a merciless and unrelenting entity that will stop at nothing to catch up with her. From the opening scene of the film, the characters targeted by this figure is seen as isolated from their peers and particularly from their parents. Throughout the film, middle-aged adults are either absent or relegated to the margins of the story. The cinematography positions them in long shots or partially out of frame or out of focus. The adult characters are thereby shown to have effectively abandoned the younger generation, unable to comprehend or assist them in their predicament. Jay is thereby forced to acknowledge an impending threat that no one else can see or understand. As a member of the age group that has been dubbed the selfie generation, and often labeled as self-absorbed and spoiled, this notion of an invisible and highly personal impending doom speaks to Jay's political connotations as a character. She represents a generation who, in our world, must struggle with crushing student debt, a diminishing middle class, a rapidly changing climate, and vast income inequality, problems millennials have inherited from the generation of their parents. The film presents this perspective through its deliberately retro aesthetic, using slow zooms and deep focus to replicate the look of slasher films from the 1970s and 80s, when their audiences would have been the then young adults of the baby boomers. The interior set design is likewise deliberately old-fashioned, and the TVs play only old-timey black and white programs, making the film's younger characters appear to be trapped in a time not their own. We see suburban houses that appear to be abandoned and left to decay, alluding to the crumbling middle class and false hopes found in the once promising real estate bubble. The lines between urban and suburban are blurring as the once prosperous middle class is diminishing. The cars the millennial characters drive either belong to their parents or are old and run down, in stark contrast to the muscle cars and convertibles driven by the young characters in older slasher films. These symbols of American wealth and power are no longer available to the new generation of adults, and are largely no longer desired, as we see when Jay describes her childhood daydream of driving aimlessly.
It's funny. We used to daydream about being old enough to go on dates, drive around with friends in their cars. I had this image of myself holding hands with a really cute guy, listening to the radio, driving along some pretty road, up north maybe. And the trees start to change colors. It's never about going anywhere, really. It's having some sort of freedom, I guess.
The material ownership of the car is less important to her than the freedom it grants her, a freedom denied to her by her lack of means or resources to travel and the constrictions placed upon her by her parents. This sense of entrapment is visually represented when the it that is following the girl in the opening scene, and later following Jay, is becoming an imminent threat, and both girls can only manage to travel as far as the cottage or the beach to attempt to escape, evoking the suburban experience of alternation between the suburbs or the cottage. The lack of exposure to more worldly or expansive experiences, as well as their lack of means to reach them, limits the millennial experience to these spaces, giving them no leg to stand on in their struggle to inherit their parents' world. Through both their spoken dialogue and the mise-en-scène, characters express their desire to return to the state of innocence and freedom they knew in childhood. The difficulty in escaping this stasis is also visually depicted by the image of the pool. Water is a common symbol for life and rebirth, and so Jay is seen floating, treading water, stuck in her parents' backyard both literally and metaphorically. When she finally tries to graduate to the big pool of the adult world, the it, manifested in the form of her father, pummels her with objects of consumerism and female domesticity, nearly causing her to drown, creating a stark visual metaphor for the ideological message of the film. The it itself often takes on the form of threats that the generation of Jay's parents might have warned her and her friends about: licentious women, prostitutes, drug abuse, unclean or suspicious-looking individuals, the it can thus be viewed as stranger danger literalized, and yet it can also take on the form of people we know and trust, alluding perhaps to the fallacious facts behind the stranger danger paranoia, that most often abductions and abuse are perpetrated by people the victim knows. More generally, the entity can be viewed as an amorphous embodiment of issues and anxieties being passed from the older generation to the new, as problems unsolved by parents become the burden of their ill-prepared children. It Follows thus presents the modern world as one that began as a dream, but has become a nightmare from which there is no escape. Jay can never defeat, destroy, or ultimately evade the threat that she and her peers are facing. All she can do is to share her burden, and find strength and courage in others. The film thus suggests that the millennial generation can no longer remain static or docile to the world around it, and like Jay and her friends, must become aware of the pernicious elements around them and share that awareness with others, else be fated to follow in the footsteps of generations past.